All right, welcome back to Overengineered, the podcast where we ask the question, what's the absolute best way to do things we already have a perfectly acceptable solution for? Today, I'm here with Ian Landsman. Hey, Ian, you want to say hi?
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I reached out to you a little while ago because I just thought it would be fun to talk. I didn't really have a game plan, but I was interested in the fact that you and I have both been working on the same applications for a really long time. And when we started talking, we thought, well, let's pick a topic and see where it goes. And we started thinking about caching because I know you're in the I don't know, would you say it's still the very early stages, or are you further along in this rewrite?
I would say early stages
Yeah.
still. Yeah.
But it sounds like you're already kind of thinking about these optimizations, and it might just be sort of a fun thing to explore. But I don't know. I say this every time, but I'm going to say it again. I can't imagine that anyone who is listening to this podcast doesn't know who you are, but do you want to just do a quick intro just in case?
Yeah. So I founded a company called Userscape 20 years ago. Our main product's a product called HelpSpot, which is a customer support application, help desk tool, and bootstrapped and profitable for every day of 20 years almost here. And yeah, in terms of like the internet community, been involved in Laravel since very early. Taylor worked at Userscape for almost 3 years, run the first few Laracons, run Laracon Online, run Lara jobs. So that's kind of my open source community stuff end of things. And then HelpSpot is sort of the day in, day out business product. And yeah, that's kind of it. I still code, still like to code. That's kind of what got me into it to begin with. Definitely not. I've seen some of the names you have on this list. I am not the level of coder of those people for the most part, but I'm a serviceable coder. I'm a practical coder, which I think our topic is kind of good at because I feel like it's one of those sort of like real world things that you hit versus just
Right.
like architecture astronaut type stuff. This is like a real problem that real applications have. So
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's really interesting. I don't meet many people who are, as established founders who are still in the day to day weeds of coding, like you and I both are. So it's cool to see that. I mean, was that something that you did really intentionally, or has it just kind of worked out that way?
yeah, it's sort of a combination of a whole bunch of different factors, but basically, like definitely in the beginning, I was the only programmer, and then that was that, and I built it and all those things. And it's kind of ebbed and flowed. Like there's been periods where we had like two or even three programmers, and there's been periods where we have less. So there's been periods where I'm not doing any programming. Like there's been years where I did nothing in terms of programming. But then recently I've gotten back into it. I kind of feel like, I mean, first of all, I just like it. I've been keeping up on it the whole time, but even if I'm not actively always been doing code in HelpSpot and some of our other things, I've been building other Laravel related sites or side projects and things like that. So I'm up to speed on everything. And then I do like doing it. And then when it came to kind of this next generation HelpSpot we've started working on, it just felt like we've actually tried to do this twice before and it's failed both times before. And I think, at least in part, entirely my fault. So 100% my fault, all the failures. And I just felt like to do it's just, I'm just not the type of person who's going to be able to communicate it to other people, is what it comes down
Sure.
to.
No, I
Well,
get
and
that.
so, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to do like the phase one of this. And then from there, once like the core vision is established and a lot of the core structures are in place, I feel like then it's a lot easier to be like, okay, we're gonna spec out this feature, we're gonna spec out this UI thing. Like we could do that, but just laying out the whole groundwork, and it's just too many things that are interrelated that I don't think very well in terms of like, oh, let me pre-think this whole thing out and every implication and what the UI is going to be, and then write that all up and commit. So like I need to be in there, feeling the code, feeling how it looks in the UI, like the actual interactions and things, and then be like, oh yeah, this makes sense or this doesn't. And so that's what we're gonna do.
Yeah, no,
We're gonna
I
see how
get
that
it.
goes.
I think that it is really true, especially like I don't know, you end up just having so much context in your head over the years that
Yeah.
you don't even realize it's there anymore, you know? And
Yeah,
so I get that it's hard to communicate some of that stuff.
and there's obviously, thousands of people who work at Microsoft and thousands of people who work at Apple who are very good at that type of thing, right? They never write any code and they're writing documents and specs for whatever software they're doing and goes through
Sure.
approvals and like there's all kinds of stuff, right? People with different type of talent. But that's that's not me. So gonna
It
keep it
also
pure.
I mean, I think it also really depends on how your company and your team is structured, right? They're built to do that. They
Sure.
have many, many systems in
You just
place.
have to be. It's a whole
Yeah,
different thing. Like there's schedules and
exactly.
there's trillions of dollars involved and everything else. This is my little company and I can do whatever I want with it, right? And so it can be whatever I want it to be, which is also part of it. Like I just like doing this and I want to be in there doing it. And so I am.
Yeah. Well, we've been running since about 1997, and
It's
for I would say about the past 8 or 9 years, we've been migrating to Laravel. We just kind of decided
right.
rather than trying to sort of set a timeline for getting that done, we've just moved functionality over as it made sense and just kind of manage everything through the load balancing side of things, just like path by
Mm.
path, essentially. And that's been a really interesting way to rewrite an application.
Yeah, it is fascinating.
But I think, obviously the appeal of just like sitting down and writing the whole thing again from scratch is very real.
Sure.
And I won't pretend that I haven't, kind of gone down that path a few times over the years too, and either abandoned it or I don't know how the code base over there looks like, but there's lots of like, well, this class is named like legacy because there was a new one introduced that was supposed to supersede it, but then that migration never fully happened. So now we just have the
Right.
legacy one and the modern one sitting next to each other, and you just have to
Yeah.
know which is which. All
A
that,
lot of
all
real
that
world
nightmare.
stuff in there. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. We did something similar with HelpSpot where we moved it onto Laravel because it's obviously it's like pre any framework really
right,
existing in
right.
PHP, as your app I'm sure is. And so yeah, so we moved on to Laravel and then over time, it's definitely not like you wouldn't look at it and think it's a Laravel app fully because there's
Uh
definitely
huh.
odd folders and function libraries that are thousands of lines long and things like that that are not in any way how you'd do it now. But yeah, I do think rebuilding from scratch. I mean, obviously, it's old hat now. People are basically, consensus is kind of that you shouldn't do it and all those things. And I tend to agree. I think that for me, what kind of put me back over the edge was like we had some business model changes we want to implement as part of this. So then to me, that made a lot of difference. It's like, all right, if it's not just like it's going to be new and nicer to work on, but it's like we can't do the business model that I think makes sense going forward on the current structure. And so then that's like, all right, that's like an actual real reason to do this.
Right. You're building a new product. It's
Right.
with it's with the history of the existing product, but it,
Right.
I get that sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
But another interesting thing about that process is you're coming to it with all the experience of running an application for 20 years.
Yep.
And I remember I can't remember what episode of Mostly Technical you guys were talking about it, but the whole DynamoDB access pattern question, like needing to
Yep.
understand your access patterns. Like,
Yep.
you were in that position where you actually do kind of already understand a lot of this stuff in a way that a new application really wouldn't.
Yep.
And so I imagine that's why you feel comfortable kind of like taking on a bunch of caching considerations really early rather than,
Yeah.
I think traditionally you would piece that stuff on later as you see the need. But, like, so what has that been like? It sounds like that's kind of, just been something that you've been, really experimenting with.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. I feel like it's probably not the place you should over engineer generally if you're starting a new app. But we have, some unique variations here because there will be existing customers moving on to the new platform pretty quickly. So that right there's going to be more load than you might have just if you were just obviously building a new app and getting your first
Sure,
customer and things like that. And then yeah, I know the access patterns really well. And even though the new platform will have some differences, ultimately, like it's going to be very similar. And so the places where it's heavy, I know those very well. And so that's kind of led me down to like, which is, into going into caching more initially and understanding where we can cut some corners and what things can be cached and don't really matter if they have a slight delay to them, or what things can be cached because they're easy to clear the cache, or all those kind of things, and go pretty deep on that initially, more so than you might otherwise recommend if you are building a brand new app and don't really know what's going to be ugly and not. But yeah, the help desk space just has a lot of complicated queries in it, because people want to see their help desk tickets in all sorts of weird and interesting ways.
sure,
So they want to, have string searches for a word, and but then they're also filtering out, these other 20 conditions, and there's a group condition, and like there's all this stuff in there, and the load can definitely be quite intense. So that's like a multi-layer thing we're kind of working on, from like the database architecture aspects and what we could do differently there, and then also then the caching layer of what can we cache and only run once in a while and have it be okay. And so yeah, I mean there's a lot there. But
what s what's the thing that, what's the thing that you've done so far that you, would would be most nervous showing someone else?
yeah, so I'm working on, that's a
What's the
good
most
good starting
worrisome
point.
caching,
Yeah,
caching decision you made?
well, this is like a total over engineering thing, right? So we're going to most likely be using Redis to cache. Redis obviously extremely fast,
Yep,
but it just bothers me to go to the cache. Like, okay, so the standard way to do it would be like, okay, like here's a query, we're going to cache this query and wrap it in a, Laravel cache or whatever.
yep,
And we might have 10 of those in one request that are cached, let's just say. But then each one of those is like a network request. And
right.
even though it's to a fast Redis server, it's still 10 network requests. And then that's like, I don't like that. It's like, oh man, that's a lot of network requests, right? So then it's like, what can we group together? This is kind of the thing I've been working on most recently, is like, which of these can I group together conceptually? So I have these like cache groups of like, the tenant is like one cache group and the user has a cache group. And it's like, okay, for those, we're just going to go make the one network request and request all the keys and get it all back at once. And so then maybe now, instead of 10 network requests, you're always going to have the tenant one probably, and you're probably always going to have a user one. And maybe there's going to be like one other depending on what module of the app you're in. But maybe now instead of 10, there's three. And so I like that. That's like, okay, like that's much better than 10. And it's probably like literally whatever it's going to be, right? Is it 10 milliseconds, or is it maybe even less if it's a really fast connection, or maybe it's slightly more? But yeah, it's just an area where I'm like, nah, you know what? I'm in here. I know that like every time I use these, like the tenant cached items, like I need all of those anyway, a lot of the time. And if I get an extra one once in a while, like it still doesn't matter, because just the making the network connection is slower than like having it send back this, one extra key or whatever. And so we're just gonna try that out and see how it goes. So so far it works, but it hasn't been, tested heavily yet. So we'll see if it holds up. But so far it's looking pretty good.
And so then are you just kind of leaning into sort of accepting occasional eventual consistency, or are you, also really thinking through cache and validation strategies heavily?
Yeah, so pretty heavy on the cache and validation. I mean, the thing with a help desk app is there is a ton of settings. and they don't change that often.
Right.
And when they do change, it's very controlled how they change. So for some things, the cache invalidation's like super straightforward. I do have like kind of a baseline cache invalidation set up where like the key of the cache includes like the updated stamp of the tenant. If we're talking about the tenant. So I could just like touch that and that'll invalidate the whole cache, and then obviously it'll be fresh on the next run. But there are places where we're just going to actively remove, reset the cache and delete the key, because again, if you're just like changing a setting that gets changed, I mean, it might be years between changes or whatever. Like, we can just go ahead and delete that, and
Sure.
it'll be fresh again for the next one. But yeah, this group caching structure does have a key manager basically that creates the keys, and it does part of that include the updated stamp so that we can kind of quickly do that. One other thing that's built in there is that the tenant updated at is actually in every key. So
Okay.
that if we want to clear the whole tenant because like whatever customer's having a problem and we just want to like be able to clear all the cache, so every cache that's for the tenant, then we could just update that and it's going to clear actually all the cache keys. So which we'll see. I mean, that has its own like downsides potentially, right? Like if you have a very large customer, like maybe don't want to cache all or clear all the caches simultaneously. But I think again, this is like where it's nice knowing our use cases very well, that like any one tenant's not actually going to be that big a deal to have like their caches cleared all at once and be cold.
Right.
So I think it'll be fine. But yeah, so
I
that's
mean, that is something that I've been leaning into actually more is just I think I used to try to be really, really thoughtful about, using, clearing as little of the cache as possible when something
right.
changes.
Hmm.
And I have found that it's just so much easier to just be like, I mean, I'm almost just like blow up the whole cache when
Scorched
anything
earth,
changes.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cause like, again, it's just a performance thing. So the app is still going to work just fine.
Yep.
The next request for a handful of people is going to be a little bit slower as some data has to get loaded, but it ends up being pretty minimal. I guess it depends on
Yep.
how heavily you're relying on caching. But I've just
Yeah.
found that the over under on that is it's just so much nicer to have that assurance than hunting down these like, oh, okay, well, this model was updating and like it wasn't touching its parent, so then I need to like,
Yep.
all that nonsense.
Get
It's just
into
like
all that. Yep.
just wipe the whole thing.
Blow it away. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I kind of had that option in there for everything. It's like, oh, we can just blow this away easily and not like worry about it. If there's we aren't anywhere yet where like on a change, I'd feel like, well, we should just always do that. But I'm sure we'll get there because there are some very complicated aspects where it's like, well, in this case, we're just going to like blow everything away. And obviously, we can just do it as admins too. But even just as part of the regular flow of the app, it's like, okay, this is like touches too many places. Let's just like clean up a bit. But yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of like, initially HelpSpot had no caching, or current version of HelpSpot or effectively no caching, very little caching. There's an on-premise app initially, and it's still available on premise. And so we didn't hit it too much early on because it's like everybody was putting it on their own servers, and
Sure.
generally it's fine, like unless they had a huge installation, and even then they'd have a bigger server. So really, like you could kind of run any queries, and it all kind of worked okay because it was
Yeah.
just the one tenant on its own server. But then as like our cloud stuff got bigger, it's like, oh, all these crazy queries people are running. And coming from this on-premise world, we'd like let people do anything. Like you could literally write your own
Right.
in the filtering of HubSpot, like you can literally put your own SQL in there. It's like so people just can literally do anything. And then the
Right.
builder has like no constraints. Like, the database schema wasn't necessarily optimized for a cloud type deployment. So
Sure.
there's a lot of
Yeah.
heavy queries and things. So that started to really be on the database server once we cloudified it all. And it's not, just to explain that quickly, it's not a regular like multi-tenant SaaS app. It's a single database server, and every customer gets actually a tiny AWS VM. And
Hmm.
so we just deploy it like a million little on-premise installs that do connect though to one single database server, so that database server can get heavy, but each customer has its own database on the database server.
Sure.
So, but still, obviously, then one customer can impact another, even if they're on their own databases, because it's one server. So we did a bunch of caching stuff in HelpSpot Current as much as we could. And one of the things that my big takeaways from that and something I'm using in the next generation HelpSpot is it's super beneficial, even just to do tiny caches. Like
Mhm.
we're only gonna cache this for 30 seconds or something
Mhm.
like that. Because when you have
Yeah.
so many customers simultaneously, like 30 seconds is actually huge. Like you're saving thousands of queries if you just have like a 30-second cache in this one area or whatever. So that's another thing that factors in for me because it's like we're small, like we don't have infinite money for our, databases and things like that. And the database is obviously the most expensive thing to throw money at if you need to throw money at something. So it's like, hey, if we can keep on smaller databases, the longer we can do that, that's super beneficial because going up to that next tier of database is always at least twice as much and
Yeah.
gets expensive pretty quickly. So there's a lot of stuff like that too when we get into like the ticketing views and like the filters and the counts and things like that, where it's like, even if it's just this 30 seconds, that seems like kind of nothing. It's actually can be a lot because if you have, 50 agents. And so the other thing with help desk is this is the kind of tool where everybody's in it all day. Like it's your
Yeah.
job to literally be in this tool all day. So if you have 50 agents, like they're in there loading pages just constantly and moving around the system. And everywhere they go to, there's a count of how many tickets are assigned to them and how many tickets in this queue and whatever, all the different counts. And so, just those little caches where, yeah, you don't want it to be ever delayed too long because people are making decisions based on the counts and things. So they want to know when something pops in a queue or how many are in there. But you can still shave a lot of queries off even with these short caches. And then there's other areas where it's not so important. Like, what is the difference between 42 and 43 items in this queue potentially? Like, there's probably not. Like,
Sure.
nobody's looking at it and it's like, oh, I'm not going to touch it if it's 42, but when it gets to 43, like, then I'm going to get in there and do something about it. So that's where then there's a little bit of wiggle room in other areas where it's like, well, for this one, maybe it can be 5 minutes because it's slightly delayed. It's not a huge deal. And so judgment calls there. We'll still have a thing where there's settings for customers that probably impact the caching in certain areas. Like there are a team that is like very real time, then maybe it's going to be a very, very short cache, but or they'll have a way to do that, or we'll have a way to do that for them. I haven't, that part we haven't gotten to yet. We haven't totally figured
You'll
that part out, but
you'll
something
have
like
their
that.
TTL cached as well.
What's that?
You'll have the cache
There.
TTL cached
Right,
for
right.
them.
Yeah, yes, exactly. So yeah, so we'll see. I mean, in the current HelpSpot, there's actually a way for people to basically opt out of it essentially on certain queues and have it just be
Hmm.
actually real time. I don't think we'll go that. I think it'll always be cached, but even if it's just like 15 seconds or whatever, like we're
Right.
just going to shave that off a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, do you find, because in my experience, the closer to real time you get, the harder it is to effectively cache things because
Right.
your users end up noticing those inconsistencies a lot quicker.
Right.
How are you? So are you still with all of those, even these 30-second or 5-minute count caches? Are you still thinking about invalidating them, or is it just like we're just going to live with the fact that it might be 30-second stale?
Yeah. So for those in particular, we're probably not going to be able to actively invalidate them because it's things where they're creating the query essentially through a builder. And even though in the next generation HelpSpot, it's going to be a little bit more, we're going to have a little more guardrails on there than we do with the current HelpSpot. It still would be difficult because you might have hundreds of these filters in a big installation potentially. And so like to like take every ticket that comes in and figure out which of the filters it actually applies to would become its own like set of giant queries and things. So we're probably not gonna be able to do that. So yeah, so for those, but this again where we know it really well. It's like the inboxes might just have no cache at all, or like a very tiny cache. And because that's one people always are looking at, like
Yeah.
new in the inbox. I'm trying to keep the inbox empty or near empty. Like how many are in there? What's in there? Like, okay, so that's heavy cache or not cached. What we call like your my queue, like the stuff assigned to you. Again, is something that gets looked at a lot and is super important. Like if something was assigned to you, you want to know about it pretty quickly and not have to, you know, you don't want like a 5 minute delay on that one or whatever. So but then you have these other filters that get built that are like a manager builds a filter because they're keeping an eye on a certain type of issue. And once a
Sure.
day, they're looking at that. Right. And so
Right.
for that, it's like, well, that doesn't need to be real time at all. And so, but it's hard for us to know explicitly its use case also because sometimes you build a filter and you do want it to be real time. So there is a
Right.
lot of like, yeah, it is tricky where it's like, that's where I think those like shorter cache bands come into play because it's like, hey, if we can shave a minute, great. Like it's going to be not a big deal to the customer, even if they're using it semi real time. But and then if they're using it not real time at all and they're checking it once a day, then that's great. And we're still saving a bunch of queries, even if it's not as much as it could if we knew for sure that they were only looking at this once a day. Yeah, we could cache it longer, but it's still, we're all the queries are being, again, since we know the use case, we're getting the queries are much tighter than in the current generation of HubSpot. So the queries are also going to be very fast. So it's not a huge deal there.
Something that could be really interesting is like, I don't know if you could use Pulse, but you might be able to take inspiration from Pulse, all the the sampling and sort of
Yeah.
analytics efficiency stuff. Like, would you
Hmm.
ever consider essentially like having some of that, especially like the query builder stuff, having some sort of dynamic caching where you're essentially sampling how often any individual key is getting hit and like dynamically adjusting the cache depending?
So definitely, possibly. In the current generation of HubSpot, we track like the number of times each filter is run, whether it's a count run or a fully
Hmm.
loading the filter, where like you're actually seeing the tickets as opposed to just like the sidebar count. And right now, we don't use. Well, no, we actually do use it a little bit to dynamically update how long something is cached. So it can
Okay.
change that. And then we also use it to create a screen for the end user so that they can have some tools for like debugging, like why things are slow, especially like in the on-premise one. It's like, well, you have this filter that takes 4 minutes to run. Like that's why it's slow or whatever. So,
Right.
so yeah, definitely some stuff like that. I don't know if we're going to need it for this. We'll see. Kind of, I'm going a little different path with that sort of issue in next generation HubSpot. Between the like heavy and precise caching on one end, and then a fair amount of like denormalization on the other, so that the
Hmm.
queries can like pretty much never need to join or very on the count type queries they'll never need to join, and in a lot of places they just won't need to join in general. So I'm sort of approaching it more from that angle of, can we lean on the database and have all the queries be super fast when we do need these queries and not
Hmm.
have to worry too much about getting all the way down to that level of like really tracking every filter or heavy query and then dynamically updating and all that stuff. Like hopefully it can be a little simpler in that zone, and then we make up for it with like, yeah, if we do go to database a little more, it's super fast. It's a really easy query that the database is going to, just be able to crush very efficiently, as opposed to, getting into big, huge multi-table joins and all the stuff which we do now, where
Right.
every filter query is like has three tables joined to it, and it's a big ugly query that does all kinds of stuff. It's a monster. So trying to avoid that monster query scenario.
I feel compelled to at least say sounds like a great use case for event sourcing.
I have I have thought about that a little bit with you guys and all the stuff you're doing. So I know nothing really about doing event sourcing, so I don't know. I'd be quite scared, but at the same time, it does. I did actually kind of have that sort of thought about like, oh, this is kind of. I see where they're going with this, and conceptually, the little bit I've poked around on verbs, and yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
probably is.
When you start thinking about denormalization, I think that that's like a good indicator that maybe event sourcing is a useful tool to
Mm,
reach for, just because one of the upsides, it's kind of like a power and weakness is, it lets you kind of decouple the writes from the reads and really optimize the reads specifically to the read case and the writes specifically the write case. And so when you're dealing with like a lot of data that needs to be read in these like really weird ways, it allows you to retroactively just start pumping your data into a new table to improve your querying without having to really change anything on the right side. So yeah, I mean,
so I
I
have a
just had to
question for
get
you
that
there.
in. Yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
no, let's talk about that a little bit because so one of the things that I don't think was has been totally clear to me, although I'm not I mean, I've literally just looked at it a little bit. I
Sure.
haven't installed it, I haven't gone deep at all. But is it the kind of thing where you kinda have to do the whole app with it or else it gets weird, or can you drop it into a part of the app, or what's your
No,
analysis there?
I mean, we've been running a portion of our exam system in an event source manner for probably 2 to 3 years now,
Mhm,
and that is running side by side with the rest of the app, both the modern Laravel app and the legacy app. And it's actually, I mean, Daniel's talk at Laracon EU, I think, was mostly inspired by some of the work that we did on that, because that was really how both of us got introduced to event sourcing when he was working at InterNACHI. And it was kind of this amazing thing because when you have this sort of like write model and read model mindset, and I don't want to get too much into the event sourcing terms because the whole point of verbs is that we're not thinking that way, but
right.
But, when you start thinking, "Okay, I'm just firing off events that happen over here, as long as I throw everything that I can possibly think of, I can kinda do whatever I want with it on the other end." And so, what that let us do with the exam system is we only wanted to move over actually 1 exam. The rest of our exams are still run through the legacy system,
Mhm,
and we have sort of the modern projectors that are writing to the modern exam tables. And we also just have backwards compatible projectors that are writing to the legacy tables. And
mm,
so you can still to this day start an exam in the modern system and then switch halfway through to the legacy system, and it just works because the data is just kind of like bidirectionally going into two different places.
hmm,
And so it actually like really lends itself to kind of just dropping into places that it makes sense,
yeah,
because you really can kind of just work with the event system, and the rest of your system is kind of too isolated but communicating
mm,
pieces. That said, I think if if I were starting a new project and I knew that I was going to be using event sourcing, I would probably be tempted to use it more heavily, just knowing the upsides. But
right,
yeah, I think that there's definitely plenty of use cases where you just kind of pepper it in where you need it.
yeah. Alright, I'll have to take a closer look in here, see if there's a new tool,
Yeah, there
little
you go.
arrow in the quiver,
Rewrite number 3.
right? Already rewrite I've already rewritten this twice, like, basically the new next generation HelpSpot is on its 2nd version already because it was, like, kinda waiting for Livewire 3, but then that was gonna take, like, a long time, so I kinda went down the React path and was like, "Well, maybe I'll
Mhm.
do, like, inertia and React," which I'd never done anything with React, so that was, like, a whole side quest of
Sure.
learning React and all that stuff. And then in the end, it was like, I don't know. It's like just didn't. There's some
It's
obviously
tough.
very appealing things about React, but at the same time, I don't really want to just be in the front end that much. Like essentially,
Yeah.
like I don't think that way about it. And so then Livewire 3 was coming up, and I was like, we're just gonna do Livewire 3. That's what we're gonna do. So
It really depends on your team, because we
yeah,
went down that path too, and we still have actually a lot of React code, and I feel personally pretty comfortable in that space, but the rest of my team really does not like that. They kind of put up with it as much
Right.
as they need to, but it's not anyone's like strong suit. And so it just means that every time we have to touch something that's in React, it's like, okay, well, I have to get my hands dirty because I'm
Yeah.
the only
Get
one who
Chris in here.
necessarily knows how it works.
Yeah.
And so yeah, we definitely had that same like, because I had the experience that everyone had to some degree a number of years ago, just when Node was fresh, and there was just this like glimmer of, well, what if you could just write everything in one language? Wouldn't that be incredible, right?
Right.
And I got pretty involved in, we wrote a couple of sort of our ancillary tools in Node, and we used Ember, we used React, just kind of exploring those worlds.
Mm,
And I think that premise is still really intriguing, but yeah, in the end, if you're not like fully committed, it really does suck to be like 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it was clear that's not really gonna work, that, like, the 1 foot in, 1 foot out is gonna be super hard. So, then it was like, well, you just have to do the whole thing in React, and, I mean, with, like, what, Laravel backend or whatever, which is fine. But I don't know, it's just a lot of weird the main draw for me, as I've talked about, I think I'm mostly technical, is that, like, the component story is just super
Yes.
amazing, and like there's just nothing even close to it. Like you just have so much pre-built powerful components that are accessible and super well tested, and there's just nothing anywhere else literally in the ballpark, so that's huge. But then the downside of like, I'm not that proficient in it, or we're gonna then hire somebody proficient in it or whatever and go down that path, and it's like, I like the Laravel world. Livewire gives me, especially with Livewire 3, especially, is so much cleans up a lot of the like rough edges, and it's like, all right, well, my one language to do everything will be PHP, with like the smattering of JavaScript where you have to get in there and do some JavaScripty stuff. So I know Caleb's working on the component library for Livewire, which will be super awesome. I cannot wait for
Yes.
that. I think that'll be huge for the whole ecosystem, honestly. But I can't wait for that either. So I won't get to use it probably, or I'll retrofit it in later. But
Sure.
uh, but yeah,
Yeah, it's funny. I still haven't used Livewire. I mean, I've played with
it's
it,
fun.
and I was talking with, I don't know, I can't remember what we were talking about, but Daniel and I were talking about Livewire a couple months ago, and he was like, "How is it?" I think I'm like in the top 20 contributors to Livewire, and I've never actually used it because
Built
he
it.
and I like worked on a project when he was at Internachi where we were like experimenting with Livewire. So we like contributed a
We're in there
bunch of
fixing
features and
stuff.
then never
Yeah,
never actually pushed into production. But
yeah.
it does.
Well,
I
that
mean,
happens a lot, right?
it does seem like an amazing option. It keeps on not quite fitting, and I don't know. I still love just Laravel and Blade. Honestly, like
Yeah, I I,
just
I
the
do love that
beauty
too.
of just sending down a single request response. Like
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a lot of
Well, it's just
times it's
so
just so
clean.
simple. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like there's no place for anything to hide. Like if there's a problem, like you know where to start looking right away. Whereas
Right.
definitely all these other systems, whether it's SPA or it's a Livewire or whatever, there is these like, where is this problem? Like,
Yep.
what is it rendering wrong? Is it the data? Now I got to be in there looking at what's getting passed back and forth and try to figure out what's going on. And like,
Where is even
so
this request getting made? You
right, right,
know,
where, right, what
or
component is
or
making this request? Like,
something
yep,
that I was kind of baffled by is like, do you know where the Livewire routes are being registered in your application? Because that's like, even that's not obvious,
right,
It's like,
yeah. And that everything goes through one route. Like all the Livewire like secondary connections go through this single route, which actually causes a little bit of problems here and there. If you have things like looking at the current route and stuff, it's like, well, the current
right,
route is actually Livewire slash update, but like that's
right.
nothing. So there are like weird edge cases like that for sure. I think much like anything else, like I've definitely found this in this new project here, being all in on it actually cleans up
Oh, I'm sure.
some of the ugly
Yeah,
stuff, or like every page is a full page Livewire component, and like it just
right.
simplifies a lot of stuff. to some degree, but still, there are still some rough edges, and still mostly the biggest thing I find with Livewire is just like there are times where it's just hard to know, yeah, what exactly is going back and forth, and like because of how it works with like bundling everything together and stuff, it's not that easy to even just like directly look at, even if you're in like the
Right.
network stuff. So I think that's some of the things. I know Caleb has some ideas around, having a more visual kind of representation of that and some like dev
Right.
tools and things, which I think when it gets to that point will be super handy and really make it a lot easier for people. But it's just kind of like anything else. I mean, there's always something, There's always something.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I totally get that though. If it's like the primary interface of, this is, I think this was kind of the thrust of the last episode. We were talking about, I don't know, we were talking about the scope of blade components, but the real conversation was just like, just picking what you're going to do and doing it, you know,
Right, right.
it doesn't even matter what the choice is in the end. It's like,
Yep,
just making the choice and sticking with it because, yeah, if you don't know, okay, is this a live wire thing or not? That's so much worse than just always knowing that it's live wire.
yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Now,
picking, I mean, that's something I've been bad at times, but, like, picking something and just going is a huge benefit to
yeah,
whatever you're talking about. Getting
yeah.
started is good.
Well, and I think it's harder to do over a long span of time because the options
Mhm.
change so dramatically and the tastes and, the ecosystem and, options. It's just like, what we did even 10 years ago is so different than what the best practice is now, and to some degree you have to keep up with that, uh, you know because other you just start falling behind, so
Yeah.
it's a balance.
Yeah, there is, like yeah, I was just gonna say, like, there is that balance of, like, I think it's easy nowadays to go too far and that like you're on Twitter or you're on wherever and it's like everybody's doing
Oh,
all this hot
100%.
stuff and it's amazing. It's like, well, I should be doing the hot stuff, but then obviously like the actual economic value to your customers and yourself is, how much money has anybody ever made because of like a React of even like Framer or something like that, where like, oh, everything's flying around the screen and it's all like it's
Yep.
bouncing and like whatever. Like but like that's literally nobody's ever made a purchasing decision, at least of a B2B app, based on like are things flying around the screen nicely. Like it's just never. I mean, every B2B app you use that's an enterprise app is like truly an enterprise app is the most horrific thing you've ever seen. Like if the app costs
Yes.
more than $1 million, it's literally the worst app you've ever used. And like that's what they're selling for millions of dollars. So,
Yeah.
it is easy to get caught up and be like, oh, my thing is bad because it's like it's not all flying around the screen, but really it's fine and nobody cares in the real world. But
I mean, I do think that there's an element of, I think I will make decisions based on the sort of perception of attention to detail that might come with some of those less obvious things. A
yeah,
good example is, do you use linear, for
sort of.
okay.
We're sort
Well,
of playing around with it. I'm
yeah,
not
I
totally
mean,
all in yet.
okay. Well, I definitely think that, when we switched from Jira to linear, like,
Mm,
the part of the reason that we made that switch was all of the little things that just were nicer,
yeah,
and a lot of that really was speed, but it also was just, the command K interactions felt really good and looked really good and always had all the options that you wanted, and just like navigating around felt really fluid and it was nice to look at. Like, I think those things do matter, but 100% at a certain scale they stop mattering. Like
right. I think it's
when
also
you're solving just like,
over time, yeah, like it's like now, like that's why like the new version will be Livewire, right? Because I think there is an expectation of like that there is a more instantaneousness to when
yeah,
you
yeah,
click a link or something like that, right?
yeah,
So like there's that level which I think has now become more table stakes, and then there's
yeah,
like the next level, which is like, well, every little thing, something floats or
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, sure.
bulges beautifully, right? Or like, and I don't know if that's really selling a lot of software. Like, and all my customers now don't have any of that, right? And so, there
Right.
is like, and linear, like here, like this is another thing. Linear has all that stuff down really well, but what they don't apparently have is real-time database backups because like they crashed and lost customer data because when they
Yeah,
restore it, their backups aren't real time. And so they're taking it from like a 12-hour old backup. And I'm like, well, that's bizarre. Like I have real-time database backups, like point in time recovery. Why don't you have point in time recovery database backups? Like
right.
that's weird. So, I don't know. Like there are just things like that that make you say, it's a little bit odd, like where
Yep,
people
no,
are
that was a little
prioritizing
scary.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very scary. I don't even have anything super important in there right now, and I'm like, how does this like this is the hotness. This is like the big thing, and they don't even have like if you're not gonna point in time, like you have to go 12 hours back. Like that's a long time back. That's not like,
Yeah,
well,
for
it's an
sure.
hour back. Like that's a whole day. Like if you were doing stuff that whole day, you just lost a whole day. Everything you logged in there is just gone. Like I don't know.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's a little off topic. But um,
Going back to caching,
yeah,
something that I think I've noticed is not like, maybe I'm just missing it, but I just don't feel like I hear people in the Laravel world talking about it at all is the HTTP side,
yeah,
really managing the cache control headers and, I would bet that there are very few web developers, let alone Laravel developers that understand, what an E tag is, what's the difference, like what is a weak E tag,
right.
and
Yeah.
it is cache control versus expires, like,
Yep,
all these different headers that you understand. And honestly, I've been pretty deep in that stuff for a long time and I don't fully understand it either,
yep,
nor do I really understand the shift from sort of like older headers to the more modern headers. But that's something that for certain parts of our site, I think we get a lot of value out of just thinking a little bit about how we can cache it. But it's the same, it's definitely the same trade off of then you get folks who are like, it's not changing.
right.
You have to explain,
Yeah.
okay, you have to hold shift
Clear
and
your browser. Yeah,
commit. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
It's definitely, I mean, caching always is a double-edged sword. And
Yep.
I don't even know, I guess in the world of Livewire, that's just not a thing. I guess on the initial render, it still can be, but for the
Yeah,
rest of
you
the
could
request
definitely
life
do the initial
cycle,
render. Could you do it? I mean, I suppose you could do it on a return value. I wonder how that would work. Possibly.
I don't think so because like
It might be
the
sending Livewire itself is probably sending some type of no cache, like,
yeah,
request.
and the whatever it's called, the hash of
Checksum.
yeah, the
Yeah, the
checksum stuff,
checksum. Yeah.
like that's
And
gonna
it might always be posting too. I don't actually
right.
recall. Yeah, for our stuff, I haven't thought about that well. I have thought about it a lot on one hand, but on the other hand, for the app itself, I feel like it would be too far. I think
Yeah.
that the
That's
having
more for, like, the
people,
front end marketing
yeah, like
resources
having
and stuff
like
like that.
your filters come back from like stay in the browser cache would probably be too far. But yeah, for HelpSpot.com, the like marketing website is all fully cached. Like, so this was a beef I had with Aaron because he has this whole convoluted thing to make a
His
what's the word
not
I'm looking for?
his totally normal static site generator, right?
Right, the static site generator, yes. So, whereas like so I what we do at helpsite.com is just a regular Laravel app that just renders
Yep,
normally. And then behind Cloudflare, I just told Cloudflare to like cache everything forever. And then the only thing we have to do is when we update it, we just clear the Cloudflare cache and that's it. So like so everybody gets not only a cache version, but like the Cloudflare delivery network where it's coming from, their next door
sure.
neighbor's house or whatever. It's like super close. And yeah, and for stuff like that, it's like it's great. Like everything is instantaneous because it's just always cached and always on the edge. So yeah, I think for that kind of thing, it's super good, and obviously, like, assets and stuff like that too, just being careful
Sure.
that those are cached and things. There
Now,
are some,
with
like
that, are you only setting the cache control headers for the shared headers and leaving letting the browser always load from Cloudflare, or are you also letting the browser cache those
I think
pages?
it was a while ago now, and I honestly
Sure.
couldn't tell you. I think the browser is caching, I wanna say, but I
Yeah.
could be wrong, which I guess that could be then a problem there a little bit, but I don't geez, no, I don't know.
Yeah,
Couldn't
I mean,
tell you.
typically you'll have, there's like
Years ago
the
now.
the shared cache and then there's the private cache, and
Right.
the shared cache is telling the intermediate proxies what they can keep, and then the private cache is just the end user what their browser can keep.
Yep.
And yeah, we'll have things where it's like, at the browser level, cache this for a minute, and then at the intermediate level, cache it for 5 minutes or something like
Right.
that. So like, but it definitely comes with trade offs in terms of freshness. It's always tricky. You have to
Yeah,
make
I
that
would be
request
worried
somewhere.
the support end of that for the marketing site, it's like, fine, we're not even updating it that much, so
Right.
it's whatever, but yeah, for the app itself, uh, you're pretty brave out there doing the browser-based caching inside the
Well,
app. I like that.
no, I mean, so we actually drive the marketing site and the app all from the same code base.
Mhm.
So most of the stuff that we do with cache control is, are front end pages that aren't changing
Yeah.
very often. We might, like there's, the user's like main dashboard view that just is kind of like, here's all the stuff that you have access
What's
to,
going
and this
on
is
or
like
whatever,
what
yeah.
course you're in the middle of to continue from, and a few handful of things like that content doesn't change very frequently. It changes, but it's only going to change every 10 minutes to an hour for any given
Right.
user. That we do cache because we do find that folks, will navigate back to that one page
So it
pretty
can just
frequently.
be
So just,
instant, yeah.
yeah, I mean, the upside is it is literally instant because it's just
Right.
loading from their local
Look,
file system, but it
I'm
feels like a
intrigued by this
full
idea.
page load. Yeah, I think that there are a few places where it pays off depending on your access patterns, but it's definitely, and it's even scarier than server side caching, because once you've made the decision,
Yeah.
you
It's out
can't
of your
back out
hands.
of it, you know, unless you're like deciding to change the URL of pages or something like that. And
Right,
you're
yeah.
you're totally screwed.
Or you're panically changing the URL of a page to,
Yeah.
break people's caches where
Yeah.
you set it for a year instead of a minute.
That would be funny to just prefix every single URL with some like version prefix.
Mm.
And
So
then
you can
if you
never
ever
go too
need to,
long.
yeah,
Yeah,
eh,
it's kinda
slash
interesting.
V3 slash dashboard or whatever.
This is,
Yeah.
like, more big brain stuff that I can't really get into, but it does seem like there are, like, always elements of pages I would love to cache. That's even
Mhm.
where, like even in Blade, like, I wish there was a cache Blade component, or something like,
Mhm.
a directive. 'Cause, like, yeah, this chunk I know this chunk is, like, yeah, it's some, like, whatever, sidebar or something that I know I don't need to update too often, and rather than going down into, like, every query that makes up the sidebar and, like, dealing with all that caching, like, I could just be like, "No, when we render this, let's just, like, cache this chunk." There is, like I think there is a
Yeah.
package out there for it, but I don't know,
Hmm.
it seemed a little I don't like to, like, have too many kind of random packages, and it didn't seem like
Sure.
you know, well, I wasn't sure what was going on with it, and I was like, whatever, I'm not gonna deal with it." But stuff like that is kind of intriguing to me of like, can we just cache the HTML output of this chunk and,
Right.
not have to rewrite? Because some of that stuff's heavy, like, or even like your top navigation bar, like there's actually like a fair amount of stuff in there often that's
Yeah, for
not
sure.
updated that much, but it's like this big chunk of HTML that's generated from a bunch of loops of various things and whatever. And it's like, well, maybe
Yeah,
we
I
just
would
cache
say
that whole
our
chunk.
our our dashboard, our navigation for the logged in app is probably the place that we cache the most.
Mm,
So, anything that's going to show counts or anything that's going to be based on access levels, pretty much all of that, we cache those queries and then just store like a single cache payload of like a bunch of numbers and booleans that we then use in the logic of rendering the sidebar.
Yep.
Because yeah, that's something that is surprisingly dynamic and is rendered on literally every page.
Yep. Yeah, a lot of
So
bang for the buck there on
yeah,
those, caching those items. Yep. Yeah,
and
that's the
that
thing with, like,
one,
the help desk is, like, there's lots of those, lots of counts on the
yeah,
sidebar.
yeah, and that one is, I think, it's pretty easy to do that, like, sort of grouping technique, right? Where
Right.
we basically just have a couple of buckets. There's just like uh sidebar, there's like a bucket that's given your role within the application. Everyone with this role sees these same
Mhm.
things, so we can just like
Right.
kind of cache
Boom.
it for that entire role, and
Yeah.
then individual users will have their own cache for their own individual views. And that way, when something changes, we just destroy the whole cache for that role,
Yep.
or and then when anything related to those counts or those flags changes, we just in a observer we'll just clear that cache out.
What do you guys cache with? Like Redis or
Yeah, Redis,
yeah,
Elasticache on AWS. Yeah, I've thought
standard
about,
stuff?
I mean, because is that what you're using as well, Elasticache,
Right.
or
Well, I mean, on
managed
the
Redis, or one of those?
existing help spot, it's actually using the no, now it is on Redis, I think. For a long time it was on the file because each is file caching actually, and
Right,
each
sure.
customer has their own server. But now this each customer server has Redis, and I believe the cache is in Redis there actually now. But that's like what I have penciled in. No final determination on kind of the next generation. We're probably going to be using single store, which could, in theory, possibly even like use the in memory tables with like a key
Right,
value, roll our own sort of thing. But on the flip side, I feel like half the reason I want the cache is just to like avoid hitting the database, even if it's just for
right.
stupid fast queries. So yeah, most likely will be Redis.
Something I've thought about is like, and then talk about really over engineering. What 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 about running, excuse me, a local copy of Redis on each application server that you have that you cache, and then either, I don't know which would be more performant, either sort of hopping through 2 layers of cache, right? Where you have your local app cache where it's just like you could just have you know, 100 megabytes. Like you wouldn't have
Right.
to have much in there, but just like or probably even less than that, but just a little space for the really, really frequently accessed stuff.
Yeah.
And either just make that, just decide which cache location you're reading and writing
Right.
to,
If you want to go
or
local
potentially,
or
yeah, or potentially, like, what would it look like if you just had introduced an additional layer where it's like, ask local first? Is it still
yeah,
going to be faster to ask the shared cache
for sure.
later, and then if the shared cache doesn't have it, do the query?
Yeah.
And you could have like, maybe the shared cache holds it for 5 minutes and the local cache holds it for a minute, and there's something interesting there, but I don't know
There
if the
is.
overhead would be worth it. I
I mean,
haven't
if you
explored it
made
at
the
all.
session sticky to the app server, then like it would be faster access wise and they'd always be getting the same server. Obviously, then like if there's a problem with that server, then
Right.
that's a problem. But even if you don't have many front end, like if you have 3 front end servers, you'll still be reducing your queries a fair amount, even if their own, even if sometimes it's duplicated into cache or whatever across different requests.
Yeah.
But it does feel like maybe it's a bridge too far. It
Yeah.
does feel like it might be over engineered
I just
potentially. I
don't
do love
know
the
if
idea of
the
local caching. I hate going out
yeah.
over the network. Like I just want it
Right.
to be all right there. I mean, the other annoying thing is I really feel like things are so fast right now. It's like I do have this temptation, which I'm not going to do because I'm a chicken, but I do. like, you could just run the whole thing on a single server. Like, you could run the whole thing
Mhm.
on one badass single server for, like, quite a while,
Yes.
especially if the database wasn't on there, then you really could, but I don't know. Obviously,
I
then
mean,
that server has a problem and you're annoyed, but then servers are pretty reliable now, so you're gonna go a while probably without a problem, but
we just decommissioned a server that was running Red Hat 4. Uh, it's from 2012, I
right?
think, and it's just been running
Just been
fine,
doing its thing, yeah.
doing its thing, no problem. Never gave me any issues. Just never had to think about it.
Is
And
all your stuff on AWS, or do you have, like, physical servers, or what are you
yeah,
doing there?
we're pretty much all on AWS now.
Yeah.
We've hopped around over the years.
Mm,
I mean, I don't even think AWS was an option when we started.
right.
It was like a New Jersey colo of some sort that we were on like back
That's what I
then,
was
and
like, just for the
right,
marketing site, I bought a server and sent it to a colo because I was like, there was no really anywhere you can, like, even have a marketing site, like, you had to have a
right,
server, so that's what I
right,
did.
yeah, yeah, and then we moved we moved to Rackspace for a while, but I found the fanatical support not as incredible as
Fanatical.
they
Yeah,
really wanted to sell you on, and the price of that fanatical support was not insignificant. So
yeah,
yeah, we switched to AWS probably a little bit before we started switching over to Laravel. So we've been on AWS for a long time now.
yeah,
And I love it. I mean, it's just like, sure, we spend a lot on our AWS bill, but it's just like all of it is just managed, RDS and Elasticache and EC2
yeah,
instances. And like, we've invested a lot of time in, we don't have like infrastructure as code, like a Terraform type situation,
right.
but we have a really solid Ansible setup. So like,
Mhm,
when we need to deploy a new version of PHP, for example, we'll just provision a couple of servers, you know, and run all those Ansible playbooks on those new
yep.
servers, and then just flip the switch in the load balancer, and it's just like easy. AWS just makes everything easy.
Yeah, no, we've been very happy with AWS. I don't have any complaints. It is a little pricey on some points, but it's like, what are you gonna do? It's fine, and, yeah, we do the same thing with Ansible for a lot of stuff, and we are moving.
Ansible is great. I
Yeah, it's
I don't
been pretty
feel
good.
like I hear people talking about it very often, but I love. I mean, I have a little script. You should check it out. It's called Ansible Interactive, but it
Mm,
just basically like gives you a nice little command line selector tool to pick, like, which groups do you want to deploy, which tags, which
mm,
plays.
yeah.
But I mean, we've been deploying with Ansible for years now, and it's just like it's just such a I mean, just compared to the old days when it's like, how did I configure this server? Like, what
Just
do
gotta
I need to
remember all this
remember
stuff.
to do next
Yeah.
time? Or you just like have a note somewhere that's like, remember you have to install this weird, like, you have
Yep,
to pin this one dependency because for some reason, like in this distribution, you can't use the
yep.
latest one. You have to like use 2 points before, all that stuff. It's just like
Yep,
all of that is just committed to Git, and it always just plays out the same way. I love it.
yep, 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 same, and yeah, that's what we do for, like, these 400 servers, whatever it is. It's like just Ansible spins them up and all that kinda stuff. So, yeah, it's really great.
What's that look like? Is that manual, or do you have a whole
No,
PHP
it's like a whole,
driven?
yeah, there's
So
like a,
it's PHP drives Ansible, which provisions the servers?
currently, yes.
Yeah.
We are doing some work to, like, move that to, like, AWS's
Oh,
Terraform
okay.
or one of the,
Hmm.
I'm not the one doing it, whatever
Cloud Formation,
system,
I think it's called.
CloudFormation, yeah, maybe it's
Yeah.
CloudFormation, but, one of the guys who works at Userscape, Matt, is working on that as a project, to kinda get that more, because it's a little bit, like, it's just, it could be more automated if it's inside
Sure.
AWS. So, just getting that all set up, because eventually, like, when you get the next generation HelpSpot out, which is gonna be a little while from now, but we want to make like the managing of the existing platform a little just more seamless. And because over years, basically we're going to do is like, kind of like what Basecamp did actually, which is like, if you want to stay on the old one, you can just stay there forever and we'll just like
Yeah.
maintain it. So we're still going to have to manage that platform even when the new version's out. We're not going to just move everybody over. So yeah, so just spending some time cleaning that up and modernizing it a bit. But yeah,
Yeah.
it's even our current system. I mean, it's been, I guess, close to 10 years or around 10 years that's been operating and doing great. So Chris Fidel built that originally way back in the day.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And now Matt Stenson, who works for me, kind of manages it and is kind of working on the new next generation
So
of that.
I didn't realize that Chris was also a Userscape fellow.
Yeah. He
Yeah, there's a
worked at
lot
Userscape
of.
for 8 or 9 years, maybe something
Oh,
like that.
okay. There
Seven
you
or eight
go.
years. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of the Laravel, old school
The
Laravel
OG
came
folks.
through
Yeah.
Userscape. Yep. Yep.
There you
Which
go.
has been fun.
That's nice.
Kind of be in the
Nice to
mix.
have. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's been
So
fun.
what did switching to Laravel look like for you when you did it? Like, did you just adopt it into the existing application? You just kind of like started to bring in the Laravel components?
I think very originally there was some of that, and then we did a big project to like basically have Laravel be the foundation, but then kind of take all the old stuff and put it inside Laravel, which was just easier to kind of manage because we didn't even have like Composer or anything. Like it's all
Mm-hmm.
all of
Yeah.
that stuff, right? As
Yeah.
you may
Yeah.
know. So this way we could like have Composer and all that, and but then just have like the function libraries and things from the OG version still be used without having to like rewrite every single thing.
Right.
So that's kind of where it is now. It's like Laravel's, it uses like the core of Laravel. It does go through Laravel routing, but it doesn't use Bleed. So things like that where we have some magic and tricks in there a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But we use like Laravel's caching and all those sorts of things come from Laravel itself. But yeah, so it's like you would recognize it as a Laravel app on the surface, but then when you dig in a little bit, there's some special sauce in there.
Mm-hmm. Does was the app before you made that switch, like, did you have any tests or any like reproducibility at the time? Well, I guess because you were what's the word that I'm looking for? You were giving the app to your customers
Oh, on premise?
on premise. There you go.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You kind of had to be able to reproduce the distribution of that pretty easily. Did you have a good test suite at the time? Did that make it easier to switch?
Oh no. Initially, way back in the day, there was not much of a test suite at
Yeah.
all. No, for sure. Like, because that wasn't even a thing way back in the day, really.
Yeah.
But no, since it's on Laravel now, it still doesn't have as much test coverage as I would probably like. Definitely the new
Mm-hmm.
version will have way more because they're just doing it from the beginning and all that.
Yeah.
But uh, but there is way more now than there was before for sure. And so yeah, I mean that part's good. I mean the build system for like on-premise customers and everything was been automated for a long time in terms of like building
Yeah.
new releases and packaging them up into different deployments. There's like for a long time we had a Windows installer because a lot of Windows customers don't really
Okay.
want to deal with like installing PHP themselves and dealing with
Yeah, sure.
IIS and all this stuff. So like it would
Do the
install
whole
PHP
thing.
into IIS and install a database or connect it to SQL Server or Microsoft SQL Server and whatever, just do all this Windows configuration. Now we've kind of moved away from that because basically the people who are hosting on premise now they're pretty knowledgeable. Like if you're hosting on
Yeah.
premise, you're like a real IT person. You know what's
Yeah,
up.
for
Like
sure.
you want to be able to update your PHP yourself and things like that. So
Yeah.
now we've moved away from the installer and just like have instructions on how to set up the environment and things like that. But for a long time it was more of a middle ground where like people were buying it and just like dumping it on IT or like it was like some half baked IT. It wasn't like an actual real internal IT. And so those folks didn't necessarily want to dig in too deep. And also like PHP and Windows wasn't even like a thing. It was
Right.
very much not a
Yeah.
thing back in the day. So it's more of a thing now with the with Microsoft kind of embracing, when they had this kind of changeover to being like, no, instead of like being all on our platform, we're just going to be everywhere and we're going to support everything. And part of that was like more enhancements for PHP and things like that. So yeah, so now the Windows IT people are kind of they're aware of what PHP is at least, and might have some experience with it. And if they want to host on premise, they can set it up themselves, and then they can
Yeah.
manage when there's a dependency that has a security issue and you want to update or whatever.
Yeah, that was I mean, I was just curious because that definitely has been one of the biggest pain points for us is yeah, I mean, we didn't have any tests for
Right.
anything, right?
Yeah.
And like I joke like our I would say millions of page views a month were still running through just like a single like pages.php 4
Right.
file.
Yeah.
Not like 2.5 years ago. It was still just like
Right.
just happily chugging along. But like
Mhm.
the other problem is all of that code was basically all written with like specific path assumptions or specific configuration assumptions that I have no idea anymore what any of those
Right.
were. So like we're in a position where our legacy code base is just like it has to be on this server and everything has to be in the exact location that it is right now
Right.
because
Don't touch it.
otherwise everything will break. It's like
Well, I mean, you've been running, I mean, a SaaS-like service for, like, a very insanely long time. Like, that's
yeah.
pre
Yeah.
the term of SaaS, I would say, right? Because it was never on premise, right? It was always
No, no, I
hosted.
mean, yeah, we're not, we operate like a SaaS, but we aren't
Right.
because we're a membership organization. I don't know. We're a trade association for home inspectors.
Mhm.
And so, we started mostly on, membership benefits and like the application process. That was like really what our
Right.
first PHP application was. And, I think if you think about like the late 90s, early 2000s, it was just like, it was just that moment when people were starting to get comfortable doing a little more than just like browsing the web,
Right.
right? There was still a lot of, like a lot of hesitation about paying for things on the internet, right? But that
Right.
was starting to go away. You had to have those big, like, VeriSign seals and,
Oh, yeah.
all that stuff mattered a lot.
Yep.
But, yeah, like we kind of rolled our own and perhaps certainly not the first but like one of the first e-learning platforms that existed on the web like that just wasn't a thing yet.
No.
And so yeah we kind of operate as though we're a SaaS but
The business
we're a
model is
nonprofit
not a
organization.
SaaS. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually,
And
that's where I learned
so
to program on the internet was, e-learning platforms in the late,
oh really?
you know, no 1999, 2000, whatever it was,
Yeah.
yeah, 2001.
Yeah, I mean I remember like just God, wait, we can just build whatever. PHP just lets us, you got PHP, you
Yep.
got MySQL, like
That's
I
all you
can
need.
figure it out. Sure. Like we could make whatever happen.
Crazy. Those were
It is
wild times.
wild. But yeah, the switch, so I think because of that, the switch for us, it just felt like this idea of trying to move the existing code base into a Laravel app or bring Laravel into the existing code base. I mean, we do actually have like a handful of Laravel packages. It's, they're like Laravel 5 because that server's still running PHP 7
Mm.
or is it? I mean, I remember upgrading to 5.6, was like kind of a miracle. And then I that don't I nobody listened, but that might still be running 5.6. I'm not sure.
Right.
But so we're running some Laravel 5 stuff on that
Mm.
server. We kind of like managed to fake, fake the user model and get a
Right.
little bit of like eloquent and a little bit of blade in there, which was kind of
Mm,
an interesting experience. I really do appreciate all the work that has gone into like making all those packages independent, because you really can just pull in blade and make it work, you know?
right. It'll do stuff.
Yeah, it will do stuff. It'll render a page for you.
Yeah, it's
And
kinda crazy.
it's pretty cool to have, we the first piece that we need to implement was basically writing a compatible authentication system,
Mhm,
right? So essentially, we needed auth cookies from the legacy system to let you log into the modern system, and auth cookies from the modern system let you log into the legacy system. But once that was in place, now in that legacy code, you can actually like call auth colon colon user, and you get back a user model that looks, or a user object that looks like a user model.
right.
We have a little bit of that, but it's minimal. And it just felt like it was an easier move to just kind of do that clean split.
Yeah,
And it also allowed for a lot of like everything is tested in the new application. Like
right,
we could kind of just adopt all the best practices
right.
from clean slate, almost like a greenfield application, but just do it piece by piece. And we have to deal with a lot of like ugly models, models that are not necessarily you wouldn't design them that way now, but
For sure.
there's still eloquent models that look and feel like it.
Right.
That makes me wonder, you've talked a lot about your sort of like old school SQL mindset.
Mhm.
How much do you find yourself like wanting to hack models and model relationships? Do you ever like have you ever written like a custom relationship for Laravel, or
I don't
um
think so. Not like anything crazy
no?
custom, like maybe add some constraints on a model relationship or something like that, but nothing too like if I'm in like that zone, then I just all go down to like the query builder directly and just like do whatever I have to do. For the most part, I don't think I've ever gone too far into like custom relationships or anything.
It baffles me. I like that's something that I want to reach for all the time, and I've never met anyone else who ever has done it before. Like I'm just like,
Everybody gets so caught up in like we're in the mod, we can't leave eloquent. I'm like, whatever, just run the
oh
query.
well,
Like,
no, I will just I'll take the time to like build a full custom, like I might like extend has many or belongs to or whatever, but I'll actually
mm,
implement a full custom relationship that handles
oh,
all the joins, all the like,
mm,
eager versus non-eager versus count, like all that context.
yeah,
And I find that it takes an extra effort to do that work at first, but like an example is we deal with a ton of state licensing. So like states might have multiple licensing departments that issue licenses for courses for home
hmm,
inspectors, right? Or issue licenses and have continuing education requirements. And the department might issue a license and then issue education providers like a providership or something like that.
mm,
And so a given course through these approvals may have 15, 30 approved departments, right? Departments that
mm,
approve that course. But it's not just like has many through, because there are some departments that are blanket approval
mm,
where every course, like we have a good relationship with the state, every course that we release is just approved by default.
yep,
And there are other approvals that like have some additional constraints.
yep,
And so, we have this class that's just has approved departments, and
mm,
it does this bonkers, join union, like computed column nonsense.
right,
But the result is you can just call approved departments on a course, and you
and
just
get
get
them,
all the departments that approve that course, and you
right,
can like load 15 courses with approved departments, and you get a nice really efficient eager load out of the box. And I find that a lot of times taking the time to put something like that together and like staying in eloquent is
Yeah.
really nice. I will say.
I'm gonna
But
have to give that some thought here when I hit these things eventually in the next gen here, because like I guess my initial reaction to that type of thing tends to be like to build an action or something that just handles this scenario and does then whatever it needs to do in its own zone. And then like I'm just gonna call that action and get whatever I'm
mhm,
trying to get back, but not to extend eloquent in that way would not be my first thought for sure. That's interesting. I do
yeah.
That's interesting.
That
Do you have a
that's one of my oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, you go ahead.
No, I just that and circular relationships. These are two things that I find
Mm,
myself just bumping into nonstop. And it just like I was talking to Aaron the other day. I was like, we should do an episode on circular relationships. And he was like, I've never had to deal with that in my life. It's like
right.
how is that true? Like
I don't know if I have either, I have to say. I don't know. I
the,
must have at some point maybe,
okay,
but
a, a user is part of a company, right?
yeah,
The company has an owner, right?
yeah,
If the user is the owner, I don't want to have to
yeah.
do like an additional query, right? To
Mhm.
get that original user model again. Or even worst case, like, you know, imagine that you have like a user and there's like a company memberships pivot table to companies. And
Mhm.
then the company, you need the owner of the company that's through a company membership pivot back to the owner. Like
Mm,
the relationship between the pivot has like their relationship to the company, whether it's like a owner or manager or
right.
member, right?
Mm,
You know, the way to kind of do that efficiently with eager loads, you're essentially doing like user with company membership dot company membership dot owner.
right.
And for a user that's a single member owner, right? You're
Right,
essentially loading the same user twice, the same company twice, and the same company membership pivot table twice.
right.
And I don't know, that drives me nuts. But
That would drive me nuts, yeah.
not
I don't
there's not a clean way to do it because if you try to automate, you know, if you try to automate it, you start to run into like circular reference issues where,
mm,
you know, if you call to array and like the user references the company and the company references the user, it's just like an infinite loop.
it gets wacky, yeah.
And it's just one of those things that I'm like, how is no one else having this problem?
I don't know,
I
it's
think about
weird.
it all the time.
Must do be doing making exceptions in our database in different ways so that we don't have to deal with it somehow or other. We're like, "No, we're just not gonna
Maybe.
deal with that.
Yeah.
We're gonna put this data over here instead, so it's, in one spot or whatever, or we're just gonna deal with the second query," which I try not to do, but,
I mean, we do sometimes. I
yeah.
what made me think of it is there's just like I was looking at code and it just said there's like a comment above it that's just this query is bonkers, but it's bonkers for a reason. And it was literally that what I just described, like users dot company memberships dot company memberships dot company dot owner or something like that. You know, like and that was the most efficient way to do things and it was fine. You know, you're loading a couple things twice, but in the end, you know, it ends up being like four queries and you're loading three things each time, so it's not that big of a deal to load the
Yeah.
data
It
twice.
depends where it is. It's just for one user. You know, it's like if it's
Yeah,
not something that's getting hammered, it's like, is it
yeah.
worth the time to like or complexity to make it more efficient or restructure the database or whatever? It's like, probably not. Like these are all real world apps. This is what I like about talking to people who have real world apps because it's like, no, this is like the ugly thing that somebody did 20 years ago, and like we're just it's okay. It works.
Right.
It's fine.
Yeah, either we had a good reason to do it that way back then,
Right.
or we didn't have a good reason to do it that way back then, but we did
But it
it
still
that way
works.
anyway.
Yeah, right, it works, it's fine.
And now, like, what are you gonna do? There's 100,000 rows in this table and 5 million rows in that table, and like, I'm not gonna like change it just for the sake of
Yeah.
saying that it's a little cleaner, you know?
Yeah, and your data size is so important with these things because it's like even that's not that much data, and it's like you
Oh,
can get
yeah.
away with a lot, right? Like with 5 million rows, like if you have 50 million rows, it's like way harder. And if you have 500 million rows, it's super hard. Now you can't get away with anything, right? So it's like there's all these different scale issues of like what
Absolutely.
what is involved at the different size databases and how much you can depend on like not even caring what Eloquent's doing because who cares? It like returns me back the models I want and doesn't matter how fast it is because it's going to be fast no matter what. Versus, yeah, a bad query obviously on 500 million rows, and it's going to be minutes of grinding away.
Yeah, I mean, people definitely over engineer that stuff all the time because, like,
Yeah,
I think we're a pretty successful company. We've been around for a long time, but our users table only has a few 100,000 records in it. It's not
right.
like even after all these years, it's just not that's not that big of a deal. Like the biggest tables that we're dealing with are like audit logs, maybe,
Yeah,
which get pretty big, but even the tables that, yeah, do have millions of records in them, like that's over dozens of years and like a
right.
pretty active, pretty successful, you know, product.
Yeah, and on a
Usually
modern
you're not
database server,
dealing,
like
yeah,
that's going to be pretty fast. It's probably even all in memory. Like it's going to be pretty fast.
right. Usually you don't have
Yeah,
to think about it. Every
yeah,
once in a while,
yeah,
we'll bump into an issue and it's like, oh, well, and a lot of times it'll be like, oh, we've been doing this without an index for 10 years and it's been fine, but it just got to the point
yeah,
where, oh, this like index that is very obvious should be there. We
yeah.
finally need to add it. And then it's like, oh man, now we have to wait to add an index to, a
Right.
couple million rows or whatever. But
I love indexes. Indexes are the best. So glorious,
yeah,
magical.
yeah. Yeah, that was a big shift, was just like, the old school MySQL mindset versus like thinking in like active record style patterns.
Mhm.
It was hard to get into that, but I feel like I'm finally there. I'm finally like, I think about, let's make it easy and eloquent first, not like let's join 15 tables together because it's slightly
Right.
more efficient,
Yeah, yep, yep, lots of joining back in the day for sure,
Yeah.
and most of the time, the active record is fine.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's not, but most
every
of the
once
time
in a
it is.
while. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I know we've been going for a while. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on before we call it?
No, I feel like we covered a lot of stuff here.
Yeah, we
Caching, old apps, eloquent.
we we didn't we didn't get. I'm still not convinced that you've given us your most terrifying cash situation, but
I don't think I'm not there yet. See, I have to come back on, like, in, 6 months or 8 months, and we can revisit because see, the thing is I'm not really I'm not full on into the ticketing yet, and the ticketing is
Mhm.
where, like, all the crazy caching is, and so I'm still kind of more on the edges of, like, the tenants and the users and, like, lists of labels and, like, just this,
Sure.
like, ancillary stuff that's more straightforward, whereas the ticketing is not straightforward and has a lot of complexity and just like, we're dealing with email and there's millions and millions and millions of emails. There'll be billions of emails in here, and
Right.
so, like, that's where it's gonna have to take a lot of thinking through and what corners we're gonna cut and how we're gonna manage that. So I'm not all the way there I mean, I think I have a good idea. We talked about it a little bit here, but, when the rubber meets the road, be a little bit different. So I'll have
Sure.
to come back on and talk about what we actually ended up doing there
Yeah, we'll
with the
see next
caching stuff.
February. You'll be like, "Yeah, we ripped it all out."
Yeah, it's totally, totally possible. Yeah, and how much like I've never had a production app on single store, so seeing
Yeah.
what that gives us, like being a column store database, there's some other advantages there. So there might be things that we don't need to cache as heavily in certain scenarios, and other things we do. And it also does tons of
Right.
other stuff. It's way more advanced than MySQL for certain things. So Uh, Assuming we stay with that even, like, right now, I love it, but who knows, like, when we get pushed a little bit farther in, maybe I'll be like, "Oh, you know what? D don't love it anymore." But,
Yeah.
so far I love it. It's really good, but we'll see.
I actually did have one other thing that I wanted to ask you about, but
Yeah.
we can leave it if
No,
you
I
wanna
got
talk.
time. Go for it.
Yeah. What's your approach to, query building? Like the f this the dynamic, giving your users all that, reporting capability, like, is that all homegrown, or are you using some library that handles it for you? Or, that's something that
Yes.
we've had to deal a lot with as well. This
Yeah,
is an interesting
so
space.
It is, like, and I feel like there's not that many apps in some ways that really have to do it, so there's not a lot of really great libraries out there. I mean, if you have some, I would love to hear them, but,
No.
in current HelpSpot, like, all homegrown, like, some
Mhm.
crazy classes that do a lot of crazy stuff to make it all work, but and then our own, yeah, custom coded up, like,
Just like a tangled mess
the
of
builder
jQuery.
UI stuff to build it and subgroup it
Yeah.
and all that stuff. And then Aaron Francis did have a tool for it, but that's
I
kind of been
know.
put to the wayside. I am planning on looking at what he did, and I might steal some things from that for sure. But it depends a little bit. We have a lot of complexity right now around custom fields. And so there's just a lot of logic there because like people can build custom fields, and then current HelpSpot actually makes a column in the database. And so, there's a table that tracks all the columns that have been made, and then we got to loop through those and like whatever. Like your every query like that deals with custom fields has this whole extra kind of path of stuff to deal with. And in the new HelpSpot, that'll all just be in JSON. So
Mhm.
that's going to be interesting. So it makes a lot of things a lot simpler
Sure.
theoretically, but there will be different trade-offs there of like performance.
Yeah, indexing is a
So
lot trickier there.
yeah, there basically isn't indexing essentially in a multi-tenant
Yeah.
solution because basically like you can't like you could build a index for it, but then like everybody's use case is different. So you can't actually have enough indexes for all that. Or you could make it predefined like, hey, we're only gonna have 50 custom fields,
Yep.
and these 10 are date, and these 10 are strings, and these 10 are
That's
ints and
what,
whatever.
that's what Intercom does. You can only have, like, they just
You
have
can
a
only have so
hard
many.
limit. Yeah.
Yeah. That would be I mean, that's not totally off the table yet. And you could just have a really wide and that way I wouldn't even use JSON. I would actually just use because basically
Yeah,
behind the
yeah.
scenes, it just makes columns. So you just have a really wide table,
Yeah.
which single store does actually have some special support for and compressing when you have really wide tables like that. Really wide tables are super annoying. Like we do have them in current HelpSpot, and they like use a lot of extra space and hurts performance in different ways and stuff. And then you also have different limits of like how many indexes you can actually have. With
Yeah.
current HelpSpot, like you can make as many custom fields as the table allows in width, which is like 300 columns usually, roughly, depending on how big they are and different things. But
Sure.
it only allows you to have 64 indexes. So you end up having to like you know, deal with that,
Yeah,
you
you have
can't
to
just assign
prioritize
index
things.
always. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which we don't know the priorities, so that becomes its own thing.
Yep. Another
So
another
right
good use case
now
for event sourcing, just gonna say.
is it? How is that? How is event sourcing the solution to this?
Well, I mean, I think the advantage there is you can essentially just decide after the fact, like, okay, this tenant, is hitting these specific, like, data
Like just
points all the
tracking it.
time.
Yeah.
You just build a bespoke custom
Right.
custom table for them,
Yep.
and like it kind of comes for free. Like, you still have to
Mm,
do the work, but like you could automate a lot of that, where if you had decent analytics, yeah, you could just have like a monthly or weekly or whatever job that essentially just rebuilds, you know, custom tables
the
for,
indexes on a
yeah, for
table or
all like
something.
your active tenants. And you could even make that like a tiered feature where it's like, you get regular performance, but if you need like enhanced
Optimized
performance,
performance,
yeah,
yeah.
like
Well, for next generation HubSpot, it's gonna be a more traditional multi-tenant situation where everybody's in one database, with tenant
mhm.
IDs, and I probably wouldn't wanna, like, break it out that way there, so we're just gonna make it
Yeah,
very performant is my plan. But we
it's an
could do
interesting
that.
problem. Yeah.
We could do the wide column is, like, kinda the other option, of course, and then just having I
Yeah.
think that's how, like, Fathom does it also. I don't love it because it's, like, creates these really artificial limits of, like, how many custom fields you can have, obviously,
It
of different
sucks.
types. Yeah, right,
I
there you
mean, that
go, right? Oh,
it's a
I'm out of my
problem.
10 ints, like, that's
Yeah,
it, right?
it's a problem I have with Intercom is, like,
Yeah,
you can't, because then the problem is you can't just, like, throw all your data at it and figure it out
right.
later, right? You have to,
Yeah,
like, be really thoughtful about what data you have to know now, what data
yep.
am I gonna need in 6 months for analysis,
Exactly,
which
that's where I don't like
sucks.
that.
Yeah.
So that's where the HelpSpot has quite a few customers that are like, we put an unreasonable number of custom fields in there, and we're just storing
Yeah.
everything in this way. If we ever need to report on any slice or dice, thing with support, we have all the data in there and it's all there. So
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Like, and there's trade-offs there. I really feel like the JSON columns solve it for the most part, especially with like single store has very fast JSON lookups and things. It's highly
Mhm.
optimized. So
That's cool.
I think for most customers, it's going to be fine because obviously we're going to limit the scope with other conditions. So it's actually not table scanning the JSON, hopefully, most of the time. But
Mhm.
there will be some elements there where that could happen. So we'll see. But it's been quite fast in testing. So
Now,
hopefully
would
that
you ever
works.
consider, like, pre-computing values?
Oh yeah, that's
Yeah.
happening for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah,
'Cause that's
that's happening.
that's
That doesn't happen in current HelpSpot, but that's like part of the
okay.
denormalization stuff that we're gonna
Yeah.
do in next generation HelpSpot. Yeah.
So we
You just kinda
use
have to.
Symphony Expression Language. Have you ever heard of that?
Mm-mm.
It's like a it's basically just like a simple query language that compiles down to PHP, and it's been like I don't know that it would work for your use case, but we have a pretty sophisticated custom query builder situation. In our case, because we're essentially I like to say the core thing that we do is answer whether you did something, right?
Right.
Like we're a certification organization,
Right.
but like to be certified, you may have passed these three courses and like got a certificate from this other like live training class, or taken these five other like more intensive courses and passed an
Right.
exam, or like if you joined before 2015
Right.
and you took this other course, there's potentially like 15 paths.
Right.
So we need to have this like really really complicated logic around
Mm.
what constitutes sort of being meeting the requirements of a given program. And so we have this really, really sophisticated program requirements system that comes with that we built like a builder UI for.
Mm.
And I'm just thinking about your use case. I'm not sure, but what we've been able to do is essentially, we're solving it kind of like going back to the caching. We
Mm.
know what values might change to change someone's eligibility for a given program.
Mm.
So when any of those values change, we just queue up a job that pulls in all the
Figures it
potential
out.
data that they need, runs it through the expression,
Yeah.
and caches the value. And that way, you know, at the database level, it's as simple as like there's
Right.
programs
You
and
just
there's
have a flag
enrollments,
or whatever.
right?
Yeah.
And like your enrollment is either like in progress or complete. So to know if someone actually like has met the requirements of a program, we can just look, do they have a complete enrollment, right?
Right.
We don't have to do any work whatsoever. And instead, we've just like invested in making sure that, anytime someone completes a course, we look up all the programs that rely on that course's data and find everyone who has like a incomplete enrollment for that program, and we just queue up a bunch of jobs to reevaluate their
Yep.
status. It's not real time, right? it it's pretty close to real time. It's usually
Right.
within 30 seconds to a minute because we just
Yeah.
spawn a bunch of jobs and deal with them in parallel. But it's been a really powerful approach, and using something that's like a full blown language, but is but is scoped enough that you're not like dealing with security concerns or like
Is this
other
part of
major issues.
Symphony, the framework, or it just happened
Yeah,
to be
so
called
it's a
Symphony? Yeah.
Symfony framework package. It's called
Right.
expression language. I think
I'll have
they
to check
use
that
it
out.
for configuration if you want,
Mm.
and they use it in a few places. But it's been like a pretty it's been a pretty good tool for us. It definitely there are trade-offs.
Right.
And the trade-offs are really I didn't even think about it, but they really fall into that same category of caching, right? Like cache invalidation is hard, and this is
Right.
essentially caching values. So
Right. Right. You're
it's
caching their status.
yeah, but it's worth looking into. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll check that out. I haven't even heard of it. Yeah, I think we'll be doing some. I don't know. See, the weird thing for us is like there are some things that we're definitely going to handle like that, like the status of a ticket we do differently now, but it's going to be more along those lines where like we know its status based on different actions and we can just move it and things like that. But
Yeah.
the custom fields especially are trickier because we just don't have any context for what they could store anything, right? And we don't know what it means to the organization and things like that. So it'll probably have to be more abstract than that, but that is along the lines of my plan. It's going to depend a little bit when we actually get in there and like throw a bunch of data in there, like a ridiculous amount of data, and see
Yeah.
is the JSON stuff fast enough that we can just rely on it, or should we break it out and like denormalize it into because single store being column store is like super fast if you break it out in tables at aggregating things. So I mean, that's how a lot of people just use it. Actually, they actually take it out of normal relational databases and break it up and put it in a column store database so that you can run, okay, we have 20 billion rows. Like, let's aggregate those, whatever our aggregate reporting needs are, very quickly, even over billions and billions of rows.
Yeah.
So we might do some stuff there. The reporting stuff, I'm kind of waiting. That's going to be more towards the end when I get in there. But that should actually have some cool over engineering type stuff potentially when we get there. It's a little tricky because like HelpSpot isn't intercom in terms of scale. So like most of our customers are, you know, one person to 200 agents is kind of like
Mhm.
our range. And, you know, tens of support tickets to, you know, maybe a couple million a year or maybe 10 million a year at the high side. So you know, it's not like crazy numbers in any one tenant where you might have like a big support org that's doing 50 million or something like that. But still, it adds up over years and years. It does add up to a lot for the big customers. So we still have to account for that somewhat.
Yeah.
So we'll see. But it's gonna be interesting. Definitely some interesting. It is just interesting to like knowing so much about the problem space and then approaching it is like
Yeah.
really interesting and somewhat debilitating at times because you're like, oh man, I know how hard this is. I know that there's no
Yes.
good answer for this anyway.
Yes.
So which of these not optimal answers am I going to choose? And then like that grinds you down because you're like, well, what is the best way to do this nowadays? And it's like
Yeah.
custom fields is like the perfect example. There's still no best way to do it. Like there's
Yep.
still no like everybody does custom fields this way. This is like
Yep.
how it works. No, it's like all the 3 or 4 versions of custom fields are all have horrible, terrible trade-offs. And that was true 20 years ago when it took me forever to figure out what I wanted to do. And it's still true now. It's super
Yep.
annoying
Yep.
that there's not like an answer yet, but you know, we'll work it out. Everything's faster now, which does help to some degree. So you can kind of get away with some of these JSON like solutions a little more easily
Right.
than 20 years ago. You could not have done that because of just not for the scale HubSpot operates that because it just would be
Right. You
destroy the
just
database, right?
yeah.
But now it's not as true. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean, like you also run into that problem that you know enough you're not inexperienced enough to not know you can't do it, right?
right,
Like there
right,
is that I mean, there are things I think that if I just wouldn't have even tried to
right,
build
yeah,
now, but when I built them, I didn't know how hard it
Right.
was going to be, right?
Yeah.
And I just made it work. And in some ways, I'm dealing with the repercussions of that still to this day. But in other ways, that was what helped make us successful. Like there
Yeah.
is a little bit of a risk in knowing too much.
There is. Like we and way back, so I originally learned the programming was using Microsoft SQL Server,
Okay.
and which even back then was, an advanced database. And then MySQL is way less advanced. And so, but obviously in the PHP space, just like MySQL is what everybody uses. So fine, that's what I was using. But like I didn't really understand the difference that like my ISAM and like its limitations, and it didn't
Hmm.
really, all the limitations of my ISAM and locking and different ways of how it works compared to like a more sophisticated database and or in NODB that we have now, which can do atomic locking and things like that. Like how my ISAM would just lock the whole table when it had the right. So
Yep.
like very early on, like I hit crazy stuff with that because I was like, oh, like a bigger install like has all these conflicts and timeouts and bad stuff's happening. So I had to like optimize stuff to get through all that. But it's like, yeah, it's like you don't even know. Like here's this huge part of this platform. It's gonna have all these impacts. Like didn't even know it was a issue. And like
Yeah.
with customers in there that are like, hey, it's broken. And you're like, oh man, it is broken. That's a
I
bummer.
we only switched to InnoDB. I don't know. We started switching to InnoDB
Recently.
around when we switched to when we introduced Laravel
Right.
and UTF-8. Everything was
Yeah.
it
That
wasn't
was a
even
big change
Latin
for us.
1. It was there was like some other
Sounds
Latin
kind of
1 type.
familiar.
It was like CP254 or
Yeah,
some
right, something weird, yeah.
weird character encoding that's like it looks like ASCII, it smells like ASCII, but it's not quite.
That was
It's
the
tough.
first project Chris Fidel worked on for us, was like, I had him on this, like, death march of, like, his whole, like it was like his whole first year was, like, rebuild like, to build the installer and updater that would take an on-premise HelpSpot install and convert it to UTF-8, which, like, basically, like, we had so rebuild every table, like, build a whole new database,
Yeah.
rebuild every table in UTF-8, and then move all that data between one to the other and convert it and fix all the weird stuff in between when somebody had non-Latin 1 characters in the Latin 1 table and all that
Yes.
stuff, like, yeah,
Yeah.
it was a bear.
Doing I We did that all in this is the only time that I've ever used, like, MySQL functions,
Mm.
but doing all of that inside of a MySQL function was magical. It was
Interesting.
so easy. It was essentially just
Good.
like it's just you just write an infinite loop of, like, it's essentially like select insert into select from
Right, right, right.
with like a bunch of stuff before and after to like manage the state.
Mhm.
But because it's happening all in database, like a lot of the issues just go away. And you can just essentially just have it run in a giant while loop that's just like, as long as there's
Crank it
records that
out.
you haven't migrated over yet, just keep on going.
Yeah.
And then the moment there are records that there are no records that haven't been migrated over, swap the table names, and
Yep.
like it's almost like a hot switch over. It was kind of an amazing because we were able to switch to InnoDB and UTF-8. It took a
All
lot
in
of
one
trial and
swoop.
error to get
That's what we
there.
did too, I think, was also InnoDB at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was even simplifying it because we actually support 3 database platforms, so SQL Server, Postgres, and MySQL, so there
Mhm.
was, like, a bunch of stuff with
Yeah.
that.
That's a nightmare.
Yeah, that's a total nightmare. SaaS is the way.
Yes.
We still sell on-premise to some there's still whatever, 20% of customers that are doing on-premise, new customers, but
Oh, okay. That's a
so it's
lot.
still a thing. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
still it's
That's
still a chunk. Well, because if you
huh.
wanna, like, a help desk app that's on premise, like, your options are becoming more and more limited. There actually
Yeah.
aren't as many, like, nobody's starting new ones,
Right.
and a lot of the old ones have converted to being SaaS only and things like that, so
Right. Well, and especially like a decent one, right?
right.
Like
Right, yeah,
yeah.
with that's actually supported. I mean, there's some open
Yeah.
source things that have no support and things like that, but that's not usually that appealing to not for and, it's like open source is very weird. It's one of these things where, like, all these companies use open source infrastructure,
Yeah, for
or,
sure.
like, whether it's Laravel or obviously like lower level operating systems and everything else. And there's either no support or not much support. But it's like everybody accepts that, but with end user apps, I've found it's not really true. Like, there's not for like any type sizable organization, like nobody wants to be like, we're going to go with the open source CRM with no support. And like, we're just going to,
Right.
that's what we're going to do. Like, nobody wants to put their job on the line with that. So it's just not a thing that happens. Like, at the very least, it's got to be one that's like, yes, it's open source, but you can buy support from the
Yeah.
creators or a company
Yeah.
that just provides support around that platform, like Sugar CRM or whatever. But yeah, so
Yeah. I mean, that has changed a lot. I feel like, you know, we used to run like PHBB and vBulletin, and
right,
we ran, you know, all these different either open source or proprietary, but just like, you know, it's essentially
mostly
just a script that
unsupported.
you throw
Right.
on your server, and now it's
Yeah.
your problem.
Right.
You can call that on premise. I don't know if that's
Right.
exactly right,
Yeah, it's on premise.
but yeah, over the years, it's just like as SaaS has just eaten everything up, and you know,
Yeah.
and as we as an organization have grown, it's just like I don't want any of those headaches, right? Like the fewer
Nobody
things
wants
that
those
I can
headaches.
deal
Yeah.
with,
You got
the
plenty of
better.
headaches as it is. You don't need to be responsible
Yeah,
for like the bulletin board script that gets hacked or
right, right,
crashes or whatever. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. We pay Discourse to just deal with it for us,
No.
and
No.
that's fine. I don't love Discourse, but I love Discourse a lot better than managing vBulletin. I'll tell you
Right.
that.
Exactly. Yeah, we used
Ugh.
Discourse for a while. It's
Yeah.
not bad, but it does a little
It's
weird
not
in some
good.
areas. Yeah.
I mean, there's not that's one of those spaces I wish there was a really, really, really good bulletin board.
Yeah.
You know, there's that Waterhole, which is a
I don't even know it. Oh, interesting.
Laravel-based
Didn't even know about it.
forum. It's it's interesting. It's like it's built by someone who has like a pretty strong background in prior uh I can't remember what. It's not one that I had ever used, but it was a
Mm.
relatively popular piece of software. And they
Mhm.
went out, I think, tried and co-started a product called Flarum,
Hmm.
which still exists too, but
Mm.
it's like an open source PHP forum software that uses a lot of the like Illuminate components, but is not a Laravel app.
Mm.
And I think that he at some point just decided like, actually, I'm just going to build a full blown like Laravel package that you can just install in an existing app.
Mm.
It looks promising, but I'm
Hmm.
never going to use it.
Right. You're not gonna bother switching over, like,
No,
that's
no.
heavy. Oh,
The migration, I've migrated hundreds of thousands of posts multiple times between PHP to vBulletin and then vBulletin to Discourse, and I hope to never do it ever
those
again.
days are done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not a fun migration.
Yeah,
Different
luckily
formats
the
and
the Discourse one was
was it
mostly their
it
problem,
it
but
was figured out. Yeah, that's
yeah,
good.
we still had to do a surprising amount. I think that's actually one of the very first things that Daniel worked on when he started at InternetG
Hmm.
was basically migrating thousands and thousands and thousands of old PHPBB posts that like still existed in a table somewhere to
Right. Dig them
backfill the
up and
discourse. Yeah.
yeah. That's funny.
What a nightmare.
It's real world stuff. That's what
Real
happens in a
world
real
stuff.
business. Yep.
Yep. You just gotta live with it.
Sometimes you gotta go down into the mines and do what you gotta do.
Yeah. But it's fun. I don't know.
Yeah.
I love I love modern development. You know, it's fun to think about back in the day, but just
We've come a long
the
way.
the tooling that we have, the fact that yeah, like you can just say, things are fast enough. I don't have to worry about it. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
like yeah, sure, a couple million records is nothing now, right?
Right.
And just all the tooling that we have. I mean, especially in the Laravel ecosystem, it's
Yeah.
amazing. It really is. Like
Makes a huge difference.
it really does. So I wouldn't give it up all the testing and CI, and you know it's great, but
Yeah.
it's not always exactly like that.
There's still some weirdness that creeps in here and there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Users,
If you don't have weirdness that's crept in, you haven't been around long enough.
right? Yeah, you're probably not that successful, really. That's the real takeaway.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, we're close to 2 hours.
There we go. I think we gave
This has
everybody
been
some
great.
listening.
I had a really good time. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'll come back in the future and we can get into some ugliness that actually ships.
Yeah, I would love that. The follow-up. The
Yeah,
follow-up. Let's we'll wait 6 months and see where you are.
yeah. All right, man.
Nice.
Thanks a
All
lot.
right. Now that I'm doing video, I still it's like we used to just bob our heads while we were listening to outro music, but now people are watching us bob our heads, and now they have to listen to this. All right.